A poor girl can't buy a doll. Millionaire sees and gives her the keys to his house for a surprise. What happened next changed her life forever. Welcome back and enjoy the story. The hunger was a monster that gnawed at Fanny's stomach, but she had already learned to ignore it. The cold, however, was worse. Her bare feet ached with each step on the freezing sidewalk. The wind cut her face like small invisible blades. She tightened her arms around her own thin body and stopped in front of the illuminated shop window. There, among luxurious toys, was she, the most beautiful doll she had ever seen. The blue dress shimmered like the sky of a dream, and the soft expression on the doll's face seemed to promise her comfort. Fanny pressed her trembling fingers against the glass. "Hey, get out of here!" growled the saleswoman, coming out of the shoe store. Fanny backed away, her heart racing. Other wealthy children laughed at her, some pointing. A little girl was holding exactly the same doll in her arms, smiling with satisfaction. Fanny's eyes burned. She didn't want to cry, but it hurt. It hurt because she knew that doll would never be hers, because the world seemed made for some people, and not for others. On the opposite sidewalk, a grey-haired man observed the scene. Mr. Stephen clenched his fists as he watched Fanny being driven away. That little girl was like his daughter, or at least like his daughter would have been if she had grown up. The emptiness inside him roared. Every year, he avoided entering his little girl's room. He didn't touch anything, didn't throw away any toys. Part of him believed that one day perhaps someone who really needed them would appear, but he never imagined that that day would be today. He crossed the street and stopped in front of Fanny. "Do you like that doll?" She looked at him, frightened. Rich men didn't talk to girls like her. "It's the most beautiful doll I've ever seen," she murmured, lowering her head. Stephen sighed, feeling his heart tighten. "Come with me. I want to show you something." Fanny hesitated. She had learned to fear beautiful promises, but something in that man's eyes seemed sincere, sad, as if he understood her pain. She followed his steps to a huge mansion. Her heart hammered in her chest. What did a man like that want with her? He led her through long, silent corridors until they stopped in front of a dark wooden door. Stephen took out a bunch of keys. His hand trembled. It was the first time he had opened this door since his daughter had gone. The lock turned. Fanny held her breath. The light revealed a whole world of toys, porcelain dolls, soft teddy bears, rocking horses, piles of colorful books. But everything was still, covered by a sad silence. She turned to Stephen, confused. This was my daughter's room," he murmured, his voice almost failing. "I never had the courage to remove anything from here, but I always knew that one day someone special would need this." Fanny couldn't hold back the tears. "All of this is mine." Stephen nodded. "This room is now yours." Fanny fell to her knees, hugging the nearest doll tightly. She smelled the old fabric, felt the soft touch of the wool hair. For the first time in years she felt safe, and for the first time in a very, very long time, Stephen felt something break inside him, not pain, not regret, but peace. The morning. After their encounter, Fanny woke up in a soft bed. For a moment she thought it had all been a dream, the man, the mansion, the room full of toys. But the silk sheets under her fingers and the sunlight streaming through lace curtains told her otherwise. This was real. She was no longer on the streets of New York. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet sinking into a plush carpet. The room she had been given to sleep in was bigger than any place she had ever stayed before. A knock at the door made her jump. "Miss Fanny?" "Breakfast is ready," called a gentle voice. Martha, the housekeeper, who had helped her bathe and change into clean clothes the night before. Fanny opened the door, still uncertain of her place in this grand house. Martha smiled down at her, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Did you sleep well, child?" Fanny nodded, though in truth she had spent hours staring at the ceiling, afraid that closing her eyes would make everything disappear. "Mr. Stephen is waiting for you in the breakfast room," Martha said, extending her hand. They walked through corridors adorned with paintings and ornate furniture. Fanny kept her arms pressed tightly against her sides, terrified of breaking something valuable. When they reached the breakfast room, She saw Mr. Stephen sitting at a long table reading a newspaper. He looked up and smiled when she entered. "Good morning, Fanny. Please sit down." She climbed onto a chair, her eyes widening at the spread. Before her, pancakes, eggs, bacon, fresh fruit and pastries. Her stomach growled loudly. "Eat as much as you like," Stephen said, noticing her hesitation. With trembling hands, she reached for a pancake, half expecting someone to slap her wrist and tell her it wasn't for her. But no one did. Instead, Martha poured her a glass of orange juice, and Stephen continued reading his paper, giving her space to eat without feeling watched. "Fanny," Stephen said after she had finished her second helping, "I've been thinking about your situation." She lowered her eyes, waiting for the inevitable, the moment when he would tell her it was time to leave, that his kindness had reached its limit. "I've spoken with my lawyer this morning," he continued, setting down his paper. "If you're agreeable, I'd like to become your legal guardian." Fanny's fork clattered onto her plate. "What does that mean?" "It means you would live here with me. You would go to school, have proper clothes, food, and a safe place to sleep. And of course," he added with a gentle smile, "you would have access to Claire's room, to all her toys, whenever you wished." "Claire," Fanny whispered. A shadow passed over Stephen's face. "My daughter. She would have been about your age now. What happened to her?" Stephen folded his hands on the table, his knuckles whitening. "She and her mother were in an accident 6 years ago, a car accident. They didn't survive." "I'm sorry," Fanny said, feeling a lump in her throat. "Since then, I've been alone in this house. It's too big for one person." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "But perhaps it's the right size for two." Fanny couldn't speak. The offer was too enormous, too life-changing to comprehend. All she managed was a small nod. "Good," Stephen said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's very good. If you are enjoying the story, type 5 in the comments and subscribe for more videos like this. If not, type 0. It helps me create even better content for you." Continuing. In the weeks that followed, Fanny's world transformed in ways she could never have imagined. Each morning, she woke expecting to find herself back on the cold streets, only to be greeted by the warmth and comfort of her new home. She had her own room now, a beautiful space with a canopy bed and wallpaper adorned with butterflies, but she still spent hours each day in Claire's room, gently playing with the toys that had been waiting so long for a child's touch. Stephen watched her from the doorway one afternoon as she arranged a tea party for a collection of dolls, including the blue-dressed one that had caught her eye in the shop window. Mr. Stephen had gone back to the store the very next day after, bringing Fanny home and purchased it, despite the saleswoman's obvious shock at seeing the esteemed businessman buying a doll. "You're good with them," he remarked, making Fanny look up with a start. "The way you care for them, it's special." Fanny blushed, suddenly self-conscious. At 12 years old, she sometimes worried she was too old for dolls, but she couldn't help the joy they brought her. "Claire used to name all of her dolls. Stephen," continued, stepping into the room and sitting on the edge of a small child-sized chair, his knees nearly reaching his chest. "Every single one had a story, a personality. I've been naming them too," Fanny admitted, gesturing to the dolls arranged around the tiny table. "This is Olivia, and that's Penelope, and the one in the blue dress is Hope." Stephen's eyes softened at the name. "Hope. That's perfect." The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 4 times, and Stephen glanced at his watch. "I'm afraid I need to attend a business meeting downtown. Martha will be here if you need anything, and I should be back for dinner." Fanny nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. She had grown accustomed to Stephen's presence, to his quiet strength and gentle manner. "Perhaps tomorrow we could visit the park," he suggested, seeing her expression fall. "The weather is supposed to be fine, and you've been indoors quite a lot." "I'd like that," Fanny said, brightening immediately. After Stephen had gone, Fanny continued her play for a while before wandering through the mansion. Despite having lived there for nearly a month, there were still rooms she hadn't fully explored. The house seemed to hold endless treasures, books with colorful illustrations, musical instruments she didn't know how to play, photographs in silver frames showing younger versions of Stephen with a beautiful woman and a small girl with ribbon tied braids. Claire. Fanny often found herself studying these photographs, searching for similarities between herself and the girl who should have grown up in this house. They were both slender with long hair, though Claire's was golden blonde while Fanny's was chestnut brown. Both had large eyes, though Claire's were blue like her father's, while Fanny's were a deep, warm brown. She wondered what it would have been like to know Claire, to play with her instead of simply borrowing her toys. Would they have been friends? Would Claire have shared her dolls willingly, or would she have been like the wealthy children who laughed at Fanny through the shop window? Fanny's wanderings eventually led her to a part of the house she hadn't visited before, a corridor on the 3rd floor with a series of closed doors. Curious, she tried the handles, finding most of them locked. But one door opened into a small, dusty room that appeared to be a study or library. Unlike the rest of the meticulously maintained house, this room seemed forgotten, with sheets covering the furniture and dust motes dancing in the beams of light that filtered through the partially closed curtains. A desk stood against one wall, and on it was a stack of files and papers. Fanny knew she shouldn't pry, but something drew her toward them. The top folder was labeled with a name, Gavinson Orphanage. Her breath caught. Before finding her way to the streets, Fanny had spent 3 miserable years in that very institution, escaping during a chaotic fire drill when the headmistress was too busy screaming at the younger children to notice her slipping away. Why would Stephen have files about that place? With trembling fingers, she opened the folder. Inside were photographs of children, dozens of them, all appearing ragged and undernourished. She recognized some faces from her time there. There were also official-looking documents with stamps and signatures, and newspaper clippings about investigations into neglect and mismanagement. One document caught her eye, a letter written in Stephen's elegant handwriting addressed to the city council. It described conditions at the orphanage in meticulous detail and called for immediate intervention to protect the children living there. Fanny was so absorbed in her reading that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching until Martha appeared in the doorway. "Miss Fanny, you shouldn't be in here," the housekeeper exclaimed, hurrying forward to close the folder and usher Fanny out of the room. "Why does Mr. Stephen have files about Gavinson?" Fanny asked, refusing to move. "Did he know I was from there?" Martha's expression softened as she looked down at the confused girl. "No, dear. He had no idea where you came from when he brought you home that day. Mr. Stephen has been fighting to improve conditions in orphanages across the city for years. Ever since—" She trailed off, seeming to catch herself. "Since what?" Martha sighed, relenting. "Since he lost Miss Claire. Grief affects people in different ways, you see. Some fold into themselves, while others reach outward. Mr. Stephen, he needed to help other children, even though he couldn't help his own anymore." Fanny felt something shift inside her, a new understanding of the man who had rescued her. So it wasn't just about me looking sad in front of a toy store. "Oh, child," Martha said, her eyes glistening. "Mr. Stephen has brought home more than a dozen children over the years. He helps them find good families, sponsors their education, makes sure they're cared for. But you—" She paused, placing a gentle hand on Fanny's shoulder. "You're the first he's asked to stay." The enormous implications of Martha's words washed over Fanny like a wave. She hadn't been a random act of charity or a momentary impulse. Something about her had reached through Stephen's grief and made him open not just his home but his heart. "Come now," Martha said, guiding Fanny toward the door. "We should prepare for dinner. Mr. Stephen will be home soon, and we don't want him to know we've been snooping in his private study, do we?" Fanny shook her head, but as they walked back downstairs, her mind raced with questions. Why her? What made her different from the others Stephen had helped? And most importantly, how could she possibly live up to whatever he saw in her? That night, as Martha helped her prepare for bed, adjusting the ribbons on her nightgown and brushing out her long hair, Fanny finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "Martha, do you think Mr. Stephen wishes I was Claire?" The brush paused mid-stroke. "What makes you ask that, child?" "Sometimes I catch him looking at me with such sadness," Fanny explained, twisting her fingers in her lap. "And I wonder if he's disappointed that I'm not her." Martha set down the brush and moved to sit beside Fanny on the edge of the bed. Mr. Stephen knows very well who you are, Fanny. He doesn't wish you were someone else. What you see in his eyes isn't disappointment, it's fear. Fear of what? Of loving someone again only to lose them. Martha's voice was gentle but firm. Give him time, dear heart. And remember, you're not replacing anyone. You're simply filling a space that was waiting for you. As Fanny drifted off to sleep that night, Martha's words echoed in her mind. A space that was waiting for her. Perhaps that was true of Claire's room as well. Not a shrine to be preserved, but a place waiting for life and laughter to return. Fanny promised herself that tomorrow she would be brave enough to bring that laughter back. The next morning dawned clear and bright, perfect for the promised park outing. Stephen was already at the breakfast table when Fanny came down, dressed in a pretty yellow dress that Martha had helped her select from a wardrobe of new clothes. "You look lovely," Stephen said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Thank you," Fanny replied, taking her seat. "I'm excited about going to the park." "As am I," Stephen agreed, folding his newspaper. "I thought perhaps afterward we might stop by the bookstore. Martha tells me you've been devouring every book you can find." Fanny nodded eagerly. Since coming to live with Stephen, she had discovered a passion for reading that her previous circumstances had never allowed her to explore. The mansion's library was extensive, but many of the books were advanced or academic. She longed for stories about children like her, facing challenges and finding their way. Just as they were finishing breakfast, the telephone rang. Martha answered it in the hallway, then appeared in the doorway with a troubled expression. "Mr. Stephen, it's Mr. Hargrove from the committee. He says it's urgent." Stephen's face fell, but he nodded and excused himself to take the call. Fanny watched him go, her heart sinking. She had a feeling their park day was about to be cancelled. Sure enough, when Stephen returned a few minutes later, his expression was apologetic. "I'm so sorry, Fanny. There's been an emergency with one of our cases, a family we were monitoring." He hesitated, clearly unwilling to share the details with young ears. "I need to attend an emergency meeting downtown." "It's okay," Fanny said automatically, though disappointment washed through her. "I understand." "No, it's not okay," Stephen said firmly. "I promised you a day out, and I intend to keep that promise. The meeting shouldn't take more than an hour or two. What if Martha takes you to the park now and I join you as soon as I can? We could have a picnic lunch." Fanny's spirits lifted slightly. "Really? You'll still come?" "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," Stephen assured her, checking his pocket. "Watch. I should be able to join you by noon at the latest." And so, an hour later, Fanny found herself walking through the wrought iron gates of Central Park with Martha at her side. The sun was warm on her face, and all around her were sights and sounds she had only experienced from a distance before. Children playing without fear, families spreading blankets on the grass, vendors selling ice cream and balloons. "Can we feed the ducks?" Fanny asked, pointing toward the pond where a group of mallards glided across the water. Martha nodded, producing a small paper bag of breadcrumbs from her handbag. "Mr. Stephen thought you might want to." They spent a pleasant morning wandering the paths, stopping to watch a puppet show and admiring the colorful flower beds. But as noon approached and then passed with no sign of Stephen, Fanny found her attention increasingly drawn to the park entrance, scanning for his tall figure. "He's very busy, dear," Martha said gently, noticing her distraction. "Sometimes these meetings run longer than expected." "What does Mr. Stephen do exactly?" Fanny asked, realizing she had never really understood his work. "I know he has businesses, but he oversees the Thornton Foundation," Martha explained. "It's an organization dedicated to child welfare, improving orphanages, supporting foster families, advocating for better laws to protect children. He started it after—" She paused, but Fanny could fill in the gap. "After Claire died." By 2 o'clock, Stephen still hadn't arrived, and Martha suggested they start their picnic without him. They found a shady spot beneath an elm tree and spread out the checkered blanket Martha had brought. The basket revealed sandwiches, fruit, lemonade, and cookies, a feast by any standard, but especially to Fanny, who remembered days when she had gone without any food at all. As they ate, Fanny noticed a group of children playing nearby. They were kicking a ball back and forth, laughing and calling to each other. One girl, about Fanny's age, caught her watching and waved. "Do you want to play?" she called. Fanny looked questioningly at Martha, who nodded encouragement. "Go on, dear, I'll wait here." Tentatively, Fanny approached the group. "I've never played before," she admitted. "It's easy," the girl said. "I'm Laura, that's my brother Tommy, and our friends Benny and Sarah." "I'm Fanny." "Well, Fanny, all you have to do is kick the ball to someone else. Want to try?" Before she knew it, Fanny was running across the grass, her heart pounding with exertion and excitement as she chased the ball. The other children didn't seem to care that her dress was finer than theirs or that she was awkward at first. They simply adjusted their game to include her, offering encouraging words when she made a good kick and laughing with her, not at her, when she missed. It was during a pause in the game, as they all stopped to catch their breath, that Laura asked the inevitable question, "Do you live nearby?" Fanny hesitated, unsure how to explain her unusual situation. "I live with Mr. Stephen Thornton. He's my guardian now." Recognition flashed in Tommy's eyes. "Thornton? The rich guy who's always in the newspapers?" Fanny nodded, suddenly self-conscious. "Your dad's famous," Sarah whispered, clearly impressed. "He's not my father," Fanny corrected quickly. "He's just taking care of me for now." "Like an orphanage?" Benny asked bluntly. "No." Fanny's response came out sharper than intended. The mere mention of an orphanage brought back memories of Gavinson, the cold dormitories, the watery gruel, the headmistress's cane. "Sorry," Benny mumbled, taken aback by her vehemence. Laura, sensing Fanny's discomfort, diplomatically changed the subject. "Let's play one more round before we have to go home." As they resumed their game, Fanny tried to recapture the carefree feeling from before, but Benny's question had cast a shadow. What exactly was she to Stephen? Not a daughter. He had made that clear by referring to himself as her guardian, rather than her father. But not a charity case either, if Martha was to be believed. She occupied some undefined space in between, and that uncertainty gnawed at her. The game was interrupted by the arrival of a man in a suit, calling Laura and Tommy's names. "Time. To go, children." Laura turned to Fanny with a smile. "We come here every Saturday. Will you come play again next week?" For the first time since meeting the group, Fanny felt a surge of genuine happiness. "I'd like that." As her new friends departed, Fanny returned to Martha, who was packing up the remains of their picnic. "Did you have fun, dear?" "I did," Fanny confirmed, helping to fold the blanket. "They invited me to come back next Saturday." "That's wonderful," Martha said, but there was a tightness around her eyes that hadn't been there before. "What's wrong? Can't I come back?" Martha sighed. "It's getting late and Mr. Stevens still hasn't arrived. I think we should head home now." Fanny's heart sank. She had been clinging to the hope that Stephen would still appear, rushing through the park gates with apologies and stories about his important meeting. But the shadows were lengthening, and it was clear their day out was coming to an end without him. As they walked toward the park exit, a strange heaviness settled in Fanny's chest. She had experienced many disappointments in her young life: hunger, cold, rejection, fear. But somehow, this one hurt in a different way. It was the pain of a promise broken, of expectations raised and then dashed. For the first time since coming to the mansion, she found herself wondering if she had made a mistake in allowing herself to believe in the fairy tale. Perhaps it was easier to expect nothing than to hope for something and be disappointed. They were nearly at the park gates when Fanny spotted a familiar figure hurrying toward them. Stephen, his normally impeccable appearance somewhat disheveled, his face flushed with exertion. "Fanny! Martha!" he called, waving as he approached. "I'm so terribly sorry. The meeting ran far longer than expected, and then there was an issue with the car." He stopped, catching his breath and taking in their expressions, Martha's carefully neutral, Fanny's deliberately blank. "You missed everything," Fanny said quietly. Something flickered in Stephen's eyes, pain, remorse, understanding. "Yes," he acknowledged, "I did, and I can't take that back, but I'm here now and I was hoping perhaps we could still visit that bookstore, if you're not too tired." Fanny considered refusing, letting him feel the full weight of her disappointment. But the genuine regret in his eyes softened her resolve. Besides, she really did want those books. "I'm not too tired," she said. Relief washed over Stephen's face. He offered his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Fanny took it. His palm was warm and secure around her smaller one, and despite her lingering hurt, she felt anchored by his touch. As they walked together toward Fifth Avenue, Stephen asked about her day, what she had seen, what she had done. Fanny found herself describing the ducks, the puppet show, and especially her game with Laura and the others. "They invited me back next Saturday," she concluded. "Then we shall certainly return," Stephen promised. "And this time, I will clear my entire schedule. No meetings, no emergencies, no interruptions, just a day in the park with you." Fanny glanced up at him, wanting to believe but afraid to. "Do you mean it?" Stephen stopped walking and knelt down to her level, his blue eyes serious. "Fanny, I give you my word, and I want you to know something. What happened today, my absence, it had nothing to do with you. It was my failing, not yours." She held his gaze, searching for any sign of insincerity, but found only earnestness and a deep, abiding sorrow that seemed to have nothing to do with missed picnics and everything to do with deeper losses. "Okay," she said simply. He smiled, rising to his feet. "Now I believe I promised you books and the store closes in an hour, shall we?" As they walked on, Fanny's mind returned to her conversation with Martha. A space that was waiting for her. Perhaps that space wasn't perfectly shaped yet. Perhaps it needed adjusting, just as she was adjusting to her new life. But it was. There, and for now, that was enough. At the end of this difficult day, do you ever feel like you're walking through an emotional maze with no exit in sight? Have you, or someone you know, experienced the sting of a broken promise? Tell me about it in the comments below. The bookstore visit proved to be exactly what Fanny needed. The moment they stepped inside Hartwell's Books, with its towering shelves and comforting smell of paper and binding glue, her lingering disappointment began to fade. Stephen watched with evident pleasure as she wandered from section to section, running her fingers along spines and occasionally pulling out a volume to examine its cover or read a page. "You may choose as many as you like," he told her. And though Fanny knew it would be improper to take advantage of his generosity, she couldn't help but select 5 books that particularly called to her. Tales of adventure, friendship, and courage that seemed to promise escape and inspiration in equal measure. At the counter, the proprietor, Mr. Hartwell himself, greeted Stephen warmly. "Mr. Thornton, it's been too long since we've seen you in our humble establishment, and who might this young lady be?" "This is Fanny," Stephen said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "She's living with me now." Mr. Hartwell's bushy eyebrows rose, but he quickly recovered his professional demeanor. "Well, Miss Fanny, you've made some excellent selections. The Secret Garden is one of my personal favorites, a story about healing and second chances." He wrapped each book carefully, in brown paper, tying them with string before placing them in a canvas bag emblazoned with the store's logo. As they left the store, Fanny clutching her precious bag of books, she noticed people on the street glancing at them with curious expressions. Some nodded respectfully to Stephen, while others whispered behind their hands. She hadn't given much thought to how unusual their situation might appear to outsiders. A wealthy bachelor, suddenly accompanied by a young girl who was clearly not his daughter. "People are staring," she murmured to Stephen as they walked toward the car where the driver was waiting. "Let them," he replied with surprising firmness. "What matters is that you're safe and cared for. The rest is just noise." His words warmed her, but they also reminded her of something that had been troubling her since her conversation with Martha. As they settled into the back seat of the automobile, Fanny gathered her courage. "Mr. Stephen, may I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why me?" "Martha said you've helped other children before, but I'm the first one you've asked to stay. Why?" Stephen was quiet for so long that Fanny thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful. "When I saw you standing in front of that shop window, looking at that doll with such longing, something broke inside me. Not because you reminded me of Claire, though there is perhaps a resemblance in your spirit, but because in that moment I saw a child who had been failed by everyone who should have protected her. And I thought, not this one, not if I can help it." He turned to look at her directly. "The other children I've helped, they had family members who could take them in with proper support, or they were better suited to traditional adoptive homes with mothers and fathers and siblings. But you, Fanny, you have a resilience and independence that I recognized. I thought perhaps we could help each other heal." The rawness of his honesty stunned her. No adult had ever spoken to her with such respect, such transparency. She didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded, clutching her bag of books tighter. "I don't expect you to think of me as your father," Stephen continued. "That wouldn't be fair to either of us. But I hope that in time you might come to see me as family of a different kind, and this house as your home for as long as you wish it to be." The rest of the ride passed in thoughtful silence, each of them contemplating the delicate, fragile bond that was forming between them, not quite father and daughter, not quite benefactor and ward, but something unique to them, something with the potential to heal them both. When they returned to the mansion, Martha had prepared a special dinner to make up for the abbreviated picnic. They ate in the small breakfast room rather than the formal dining room, and Stephen told stories of his own childhood, of the mischief he and his brother had gotten into, of his first job selling newspapers on the corner, of how he had built his businesses from humble beginnings. Fanny found herself laughing at his tales, and was surprised to realize it was the first time she had truly laughed since coming to the mansion. Not a polite chuckle or a nervous titter, but a genuine, full-bodied laugh that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her that had been silent for a very long time. After dinner, as she prepared for bed with Martha's help, Fanny found herself humming a tune she had heard in the park, a melody played by a street musician that had stuck in her mind. For the first time since arriving at the mansion, she didn't fall asleep wondering if it would all disappear by morning. Instead, she drifted off with plans and hopes for the days ahead. The park on Saturday, her new books to read, perhaps even asking Stephen if she might learn to play the beautiful piano that stood untouched in the music room. The next morning, Fanny woke with a sense of purpose. After breakfast, she asked Martha for cleaning supplies and spent the morning carefully dusting each doll in Claire's room, washing their porcelain faces with a soft cloth, brushing their hair, and straightening their clothes. She arranged them not as they had been, in static, pristine rows, but in small scenes of life and activity, having tea parties, reading tiny books, playing games with each other. Martha watched from the doorway for a while without speaking, then quietly withdrew, only to return an hour later with Stephen beside her. "Martha thought I should see what you've been doing," he said, his voice carefully neutral as he surveyed the transformed room. Fanny's hands stilled on the doll she was adjusting. "Are you angry? I should have asked first." "No," Stephen said, quickly. "Not angry, just surprised." He stepped further into the room, examining the arrangements she had created. "You've given them life." "They were too lonely before," Fanny explained, relaxing slightly, "all lined up and never touched. Toys should be played with, don't you think?" Something shifted in Stephen's expression, a tension releasing, a shadow lifting. "Yes," he agreed softly. "Yes, they should." He moved to a tall cabinet in the corner and opened it, revealing shelves filled with board games, puzzles, and art supplies. Claire loved games. Perhaps we could try one. If you're interested?" Fanny nodded eagerly, and soon they were seated on the floor, a parcheesi board between them, colourful pieces moving around the track as they rolled dice and laughed at each other's competitive spirit. Martha brought them lemonade and cookies, and the afternoon stretched on in a comfortable bubble of simple pleasure. It became a ritual. Every Sunday afternoon, they would choose a game from the cabinet and play together in Claire's room. Sometimes Martha would join them, sometimes the cook or the gardener. The room that had been sealed in grief for so long gradually transformed into a place of joy and connection. As summer bloomed in full force outside, Fanny's life settled into pleasant rhythms. Weekday mornings were spent with a tutor whom Stephen had engaged to prepare her for formal schooling in the fall. Afternoons were for reading in the garden, helping Martha with simple household tasks, or exploring the city with Stephen when his work allowed. Saturdays were for the park, where she now had a circle of friends who greeted her with genuine pleasure each week, and Sundays were for games and laughter in what everyone now simply called the toy room, rather than Claire's room. The change in terminology had happened naturally without discussion, but it represented a profound shift in the household's healing process. As July turned to August, Stephen surprised Fanny one evening during dinner. "I've been thinking," he said, setting down his fork. "You've been cooped up in the city all summer. How would you feel about visiting my country house in Connecticut? We have a private lake there and woods to explore. It might be a nice change before school begins in September." Fanny's eyes widened. "A lake? A real lake? Complete with ducks, fish, and a small rowboat," Stephen confirmed with a smile. "We could stay for 2 weeks if you'd like." "Yes, please," Fanny exclaimed, forgetting her usual restraint in her excitement. And so 3 days later, they set off in Stephen's automobile, heading north out of the city. Fanny pressed her face against the window, watching as crowded tenements and bustling streets gave way to smaller towns and eventually rolling countryside. Martha had come along, as had Cook and Mr. Jenkins, the gardener who also served as Stephen's occasional driver. When they finally arrived at the country house, which turned out to be nearly as grand as the city mansion, though more rustic in style, Fanny could scarcely contain herself. While the adults unloaded luggage and opened shutters, she ran straight to the edge of the lake that glimmered beyond a stretch of lawn. The water was clear and cool, rippling gently in the summer breeze. Tall pines surrounded the opposite shore, their reflections creating a perfect mirror image on the lake's surface. Fanny knelt and dipped her fingers in, marveling at the sensation. "Do you know how to swim?" Stephen asked, coming to stand beside her. Fanny shook her head. "No, there wasn't anywhere to learn." "Would you like to? The shallow end is perfect for beginners." She looked up at him, uncertainty mixing with eagerness. "What if I'm not good at it?" Stephen's expression softened. "Fanny, not everything in life is about being good at something the first time you try. Some things are simply about the joy of the experience." Those words, so simple yet profound, stayed with Fanny throughout the following days, as Stephen patiently taught her to float, then kick, then finally swim short distances in the lake's protected cove. Each day, she grew stronger and more confident, until she could paddle all the way to the small floating platform anchored 20 yards from shore. The lake became the center of their country days. They fished in the mornings, with Stephen showing her how to bait the hook and cast the line. They picnicked on the grassy bank in the afternoons, reading books aloud to each other as dragonflies zoomed past. And in the evenings, they sat on the wide porch of the house watching fireflies emerge as the sky faded from blue to purple to black, brilliant with stars that were never visible in the city. One evening, as they sat in comfortable silence, Stephen cleared his throat. "Fanny, I've been corresponding with Headmaster Williams at Grayson Academy. It's a very good school not far from our city home. He's agreed to admit you for the fall term." Fanny's stomach tightened with anxiety. A boarding school. The thought of leaving the safety and comfort she had found with Stephen was terrifying. "No," he assured her quickly. "It's a day school. You'll come home every afternoon, but it's important that you receive a proper education. I've told Headmaster Williams about your unconventional background, and he understands that you may need extra support in some subjects at first." Fanny relaxed slightly, though the prospect of school, of being surrounded by children who had never known hunger or homelessness, still intimidated her. What if the other students don't like me? What if they can tell I don't belong? "You belong exactly where you are," Stephen said firmly, "and any child who can't see your worth isn't worth your worry." He paused, then added, "Besides, you've already made friends at the park. School won't be so different." But it was different, as Fanny discovered when September arrived, and she found herself walking up the imposing stone steps of Grayson Academy, dressed in a crisp new uniform with her hair neatly braided. The other students moved with a confidence she couldn't match, greeting each other loudly after the summer separation, paying little attention to the quiet new girl in their midst. Her first days were a blur of confusion, finding classrooms, learning rules, trying to keep up with lessons built on educational foundations she had never received. Each evening she returned to the mansion exhausted and overwhelmed, retreating to her room after dinner to struggle with homework that often left her in tears of frustration. Stephen noticed, of course, but gave her space, understanding intuitively that Fanny's pride would make it difficult for her to admit when she was floundering. Instead, he arranged for her tutor to continue coming in the evenings to help her bridge the gaps in her knowledge. By the third week of school, things had begun to improve slightly. Fanny had caught the attention of her English teacher, Miss Caldwell, who recognized in her a deep love of literature that transcended her educational deficits, and she had made a tentative friendship with a girl named Greta, who sat beside her in mathematics and generously shared her notes. But there were still challenges. A group of girls led by a student named Violet had taken to whispering and giggling whenever Fanny passed. During lunch one day, Fanny overheard Violet speaking loudly enough to ensure she would be heard. "My mother says it's all very strange, a man his age suddenly taking in a girl from nowhere. She says there must be something improper about it." Fanny's cheeks burned as she stared down at her sandwich, pretending not to hear. "My father says it's just because he lost his daughter," another girl replied. "He's trying to replace her with a charity case." "Well, she certainly looks the part," Violet sniffed. "Did you see those awful shoes she had on the first day, before someone obviously bought her proper ones?" Fanny fought back tears, remembering the pair of worn-out shoes she had arrived at the mansion in, the only possession she had brought with her besides the clothes on her back. She had kept them, hidden in the back of her closet, a reminder of where she had come from. That afternoon she was quieter than usual on the walk home with Martha. When they arrived at the mansion, instead of heading to the kitchen for her usual after-school snack, she went straight upstairs to the toy room and closed the door. Surrounded by the dolls she had come to love, Fanny finally let the tears fall. She had been foolish to think she could ever truly belong in Stephen's world, a world of mansions and private lakes, of expensive schools, and people who had never known what it was to be hungry or cold or afraid. She didn't hear the door open, didn't realize she wasn't alone until Stephen spoke her name softly. "Fanny, what's happened?" She wiped at her tears hastily, embarrassed to be caught crying. "Nothing. I'm fine." Stephen sighed and came to sit beside her on the window seat. "I've lived long enough to know that when someone says they're fine in that particular tone of voice, they are anything but fine." Despite herself, Fanny gave a watery chuckle. Then, haltingly, she told him about Violet and the others, about their whispers and cruelty, about her growing certainty that she would never fit in at Grayson or anywhere else in his world. Stephen listened without interrupting, his face growing increasingly troubled. When she had finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry they hurt you," he said finally. "Children can be unspeakably cruel sometimes. Adults too, for that matter." He gestured toward the blue-dressed doll that sat on Fanny's lap, Hope, her first and still favorite. "Do you remember the day we met? The saleswoman who chased you away from the shop window?" Fanny nodded. "I was furious with her," Stephen admitted. "I wanted to go into that store and buy every single doll, just to prove that her judgment was wrong and harmful. But then I realized something more important needed to happen." "What was that?" "You needed to know that you matter, not because I could buy you things, but because you are inherently worthy of kindness and respect." He paused, meeting her eyes. "The girls at school who are being unkind, they've never had to question their place in the world. They've never faced real hardship or learned real empathy. In that way, you're actually far ahead of them." Fanny considered this perspective. "But they're right about one thing. I'm not Claire. I can't replace her." "No, you can't," Stephen agreed, softly. "Nor should you try. Claire was Claire and Fanny is Fanny. I brought you into my home not to replace someone I lost, but to save someone I found." The simple truth of his words washed over her like a wave. For the first time, she truly believed that Stephen wanted her for herself, not as a substitute, not as a charity project, but as Fanny. "There will always be Violets in the world," Stephen continued. "People who judge what they don't understand, who need to feel superior by making others feel small. The question is, will you let them define who you are?" Fanny straightened her shoulders, something resolute shifting inside her. "No, I won't. Stephen smiled, a look of unmistakable pride in his eyes. Good. Now, I happen to know that Cook has made your favorite chocolate cake for dessert tonight. Shall we go down and see if we can persuade her to give us an early slice? As they walked downstairs together, Fanny realized that the toy room no longer felt like Claire's space that she was borrowing. It had become a place where she belonged, a safe harbor where she could be entirely herself. And Stephen, with his quiet strength and unwavering support, had become something she had never dared to hope for: family. That night, before falling asleep, Fanny made a decision. Tomorrow at school, she would hold her head high. She would answer Violet's cruelty not with tears or retreat, but with the dignified confidence that Stephen had shown her. She would prove to herself, most of all, that she deserved her place in this new life. And for the first time since coming to live at the mansion, she slept without a single nightmare disturbing her rest. The following weeks brought gradual but significant changes. True to her resolution, Fanny began each school day with quiet determination, focusing on her studies rather than the whispers that sometimes followed her. Miss Caldwell, noticing her growing confidence in English class, encouraged her to write a story for the school's literary magazine, an opportunity that both terrified and thrilled her. At home, she and Stephen settled into comfortable routines that strengthened their bond. Sunday game afternoons expanded to include music lessons, with Stephen teaching her to play simple melodies on the piano that had stood silent for so long. Martha showed her how to bake cookies and sew simple repairs, practical skills that gave Fanny a sense of contribution to the household. And most importantly, Fanny began to truly believe that her place in Stephen's home was secure, not temporary charity, but a permanent arrangement born of genuine care and commitment. It was late October when everything changed again. The morning had begun like any other: breakfast with Stephen, a walk to school with Martha, classes that challenged but no longer overwhelmed her. But when she returned home that afternoon, she immediately sensed that something was wrong. The house had a tense, hushed quality, and Martha was waiting at the door with an unusually serious expression. "Mr. Stephen would like to see you in his study, Miss Fanny," she said, taking Fanny's coat and school bag. "Am I in trouble?" Fanny asked, her old insecurities flaring. "No, child, but there's a situation that concerns you." Heart-pounding, Fanny made her way to Stephen's study, a room she rarely entered. She knocked tentatively on the heavy door. "Come in, Fanny," Stephen called. She entered to find Stephen sitting behind his desk, his expression grave. Seated across from him was a thin woman in a shabby coat, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. When the woman turned toward the door, Fanny felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "Hello, Francesca," the woman said, rising. "It's been a long time." Fanny gripped the doorframe for support, unable to speak. Those features, once familiar, now strange, belonged to someone she had convinced herself she would never see again. Her mother. The woman who had abandoned her at Gavinson Orphanage 6 years ago, promising to return once she got back on her feet. The woman whose face had gradually faded from Fanny's memory as years passed without a visit or a letter. "Mrs. Kelly claims to be your mother," Stephen said, his voice carefully neutral. "She arrived this morning with documentation to support her claim." "I've been looking for you for years," Mrs. Kelly said, taking a step toward Fanny. "Ever since I got myself straightened out. When I went back to Gavinson, they said you'd run away. I nearly gave up hope of finding you." Fanny remained frozen, a storm of emotions: shock, confusion, anger, fear, rendering her speechless. "Mrs. Kelly has expressed a desire to re-establish her relationship with you," Stephen continued, choosing his words with evident care. "And legally, as your mother, she has certain rights." The implication hit Fanny like a physical blow. This woman, this stranger who shared her blood but had abandoned her to the cruelties of Gavinson, could take her away from Stephen, from the home and security she had finally found. "No," she whispered, finding her voice at last. "No, I won't go with you." Mrs. Kelly's face hardened slightly. "Francesca, I'm your mother. You belong with me." "You stopped being my mother when you left me there," Fanny replied, her voice rising. "You said you'd come back in a month. It's been 6 years. I had problems back then, Mrs. Kelly said defensively. I was sick, but I'm better now. I have a job, an apartment. I can take care of you properly. I don't want to be taken care of by you, Fanny cried, tears beginning to stream down her face. I want to stay here with Mr. Stephen. Stephen stood, moving around the desk to stand, beside Fanny. Perhaps we should all take some time to consider what's best for Fanny, he suggested, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. This is a significant shock for her, Mrs. Kelly. Surely you can understand that. For a moment, Fanny thought Mrs. Kelly might argue, but eventually she nodded. I'm staying at the Hamilton Hotel downtown. I'll come back tomorrow, when Francesca has had time to process this. She gathered her worn purse and moved toward the door, pausing to look back at Fanny. I really did try to find you, you know. After she had gone, Fanny collapsed into one of the leather chairs, her legs no longer able to support her. She's going to take me away, isn't she? Stephen knelt beside her chair, taking her trembling hands in his. Not if I can help it. But Fanny, I need to be honest with you. The legal situation is complicated. Mrs. Kelly did abandon you, but she never legally terminated her parental rights. That gives her certain legal claims. But what about what I want? Fanny asked, her voice cracking. Doesn't that matter? It matters to me more than anything, Stephen assured her, and it will matter to the court, especially given your age. But we need to proceed carefully. He squeezed her hands. I've already called my lawyer. He'll be here in an hour to discuss our options. Fanny nodded, trying to control her tears. I won't go with her, Mr. Stephen. I won't. The remaining hours of that day passed in a blur of adult conversations and legal terminology that Fanny only partially understood. Stephen's lawyer, Mr. Harrison, asked her questions about her time at Gavinson, about her mother's disappearance, about what she wanted now. He took copious notes and spoke with Stephen in lowered voices that nevertheless carried phrases like emergency, guardianship, and fitness hearing. That night, when Martha came to help her prepare for bed, Fanny couldn't stop the questions that tumbled out. What if the court makes me go with her? What if I never see Mr. Stephen again? What if she abandons me somewhere else? Martha sat on the edge of the bed, running a gentle hand over Fanny's hair. Mr. Stephen won't let that happen, child. He's a powerful man with powerful friends, and judges aren't in the habit of sending children to homes where they don't want to be, especially when there's a history like yours. But what if— No more what-ifs tonight, Martha interrupted firmly. You'll make yourself sick with worry. Let the adults handle this part. Your job is to remember that you are safe and loved no matter what happens. Despite Martha's reassurances, Fanny lay awake long into the night, listening to the ticking of the clock and the occasional murmur of voices from downstairs as Stephen and his lawyer continued their discussions. When she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, her dreams were filled with shadowy figures trying to drag her away from a home that kept receding into the distance. The next morning brought a surprising development. Mrs. Kelly arrived not alone, but accompanied by a sharply dressed man who introduced himself as Joseph Turner, an attorney with the firm of Blackwood and Associates. My client wishes to discuss a potential arrangement that might satisfy all parties, Mr. Turner announced smoothly, once they were all seated in Stephen's study. Stephen raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Mr. Turner glanced at Mrs. Kelly, who gave a small nod. Mrs. Kelly recognizes that her daughter has established a connection with you, Mr. Thornton. She also acknowledges that her previous actions caused significant harm, regardless of the circumstances that led to them. Fanny, seated beside Stephen, held her breath. However, Mr. Turner continued, she is still Francesca's mother and wishes to rebuild their relationship. What she proposes is a compromise. Francesca would continue to reside with you and attend her current school, but Mrs. Kelly would have regular visitation rights. Perhaps Sunday afternoons to start. Stephen's expression revealed nothing of his thoughts. And what does Mrs. Kelly hope to gain from this arrangement? Mr. Turner hesitated, exchanging another glance with Mrs. Kelly before responding. My client believes this solution best serves her daughter's interests, while allowing her to fulfill her maternal obligations. A very diplomatic answer, Stephen noted dryly, but not, I think, a complete one. He turned his attention directly to Mrs. Kelly. Why did you really come looking for Fanny after all this time? Mrs. Kelly shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Like I said, I've been looking for years. Yes, but why now? Why not 2 years ago or 4, Stephen pressed. And how did you find her? Fanny has been with me for less than 6 months, and her presence here isn't common knowledge. A flush crept up Mrs. Kelly's neck. I saw a picture in the newspaper. You were at some charity event and she was with you. The caption didn't name her, but I knew immediately. Stephen nodded slowly, as if a suspicion had been confirmed. I see. And this arrangement you're proposing, it would be formalized how? Exactly, Mr. Turner smoothly interjected. We would draw up a legal agreement detailing the custody and visitation terms. Mrs. Kelly would retain her parental rights, but grant you guardianship. And in return? Stephen asked bluntly. There was a moment of uncomfortable silence before Mrs. Kelly spoke. I'm not in a great financial situation, Mr. Thornton. I could use some assistance. And there it was, the truth behind the sudden reappearance, behind the talk of compromise and maternal obligations. Money. Stephen's face hardened. I see. So this is essentially a negotiation about how much it will cost me to keep Fanny. Mr. Turner cleared his throat. I wouldn't characterize it that way, Mr. Thornton. Mrs. Kelly has legitimate rights as Fanny's mother, rights she could fully exercise if she wished. That she's willing to consider this arrangement shows her concern for her daughter's well-being. Throughout this exchange, Fanny had remained silent, her emotions cycling between hope that she might stay with Stephen and disgust at her mother's transparent motives. Now she could no longer contain herself. How much? Everyone turned to look at her. How much are you asking for? Fanny repeated, staring directly at the woman who had given birth to her, but had never truly been a mother to her. Mrs. Kelly had the grace to look ashamed. Francesca, it's not like that. Yes, it is, Fanny interrupted, a strange calm settling over her. You didn't come looking for me because you missed me or because you love me. You saw a picture and realized I might be worth something to you now. She turned to Stephen. I don't want to see her, not even on Sundays, not ever. Stephen's expression softened as he looked at her, pride mingling with concern. Fanny, are you certain? She is your mother, regardless of what's happened. In time, you might... She's not my mother, Fanny said firmly. Not anymore. She stood, drawing herself up to her full height, which suddenly seemed taller than her 12 years would suggest. I have a home now, and people who care about me. I don't need anything from her. The room fell silent, the adults seemingly at a loss for how to respond to this unexpected assertion of will from a child they had been discussing, as if she weren't present. Finally Stephen spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority that Fanny had come to rely on. I think Fanny has made her position clear. However, I recognize that legally this situation requires resolution. He turned to Mr. Turner. Have your client sign full legal guardianship over to me, with no visitation rights, and I will provide a one-time payment that should be more than generous. My lawyer will contact you this afternoon with the details. Mrs. Kelly began to protest, but Mr. Turner placed a restraining hand on her arm, clearly recognizing that this was the best outcome they could hope for. We'll await your lawyer's call. After they had left, Fanny remained standing, a strange mixture of emotions swirling within her, anger, relief, and something else she couldn't quite name. Stephen moved to stand beside her. Are you all right? I think so, she said slowly. I never thought I'd see her again. And when I did, I realized I don't need her anymore. Is that terrible of me? No, Stephen replied gently. It's honest. And sometimes honesty is the kindest thing we can offer ourselves. He paused, then added, Fanny, I want you to know that whatever happens legally, this is your home for as long as you want it to be, whether that's until you're grown or forever. Fanny looked up at him, seeing the truth of his words reflected in his eyes. I'd like forever, please. Stephen smiled, and the last piece of uncertainty in Fanny's heart finally settled into place. She had found her home, not in a room full of dolls, but in the unconditional acceptance of a man who had been as lost as she was until they found each other. The legal proceedings that followed were complex but relatively swift, Mrs. Kelly, motivated by the financial settlement Stephen offered, signed the necessary papers transferring full guardianship to him. The court, taking into account Fanny's clearly expressed wishes and the documented history of abandonment, approved the arrangement with minimal complications. By Christmas, it was official. Fanny was legally, permanently part of Stephen's household. To celebrate, he organized a small party with Martha, Cook, Mr. Jenkins, and a few of Fanny's friends from school, including Greta, whose friendship had deepened over the challenging autumn months and who had stood by Fanny even when Violet and her followers had tried to exploit the gossip about Fanny's mother's reappearance. The mansion was transformed with evergreen garlands, red ribbons, and twinkling lights. A massive tree stood in the grand foyer, its branches heavy with ornaments, many of which Fanny had helped select. The air was rich with the smells of gingerbread, roasting chestnuts, and pine. But the true magic of the evening came after the guests had departed, when Stephen led Fanny to his study and presented her with a small, velvet-covered box. "This is for you," he said, watching as she carefully opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of white satin, was a delicate silver locket in the shape of a heart. Fanny lifted it with reverent fingers, opening the tiny clasp to reveal 2 miniature photographs inside, one of Stephen and one of Fanny herself, taken during their summer, at the lake. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "Turn it over," Stephen instructed gently. On the back, engraved in flowing script, were the words, "Family is where you find it." "Do you like it?" Stephen asked, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. In answer, Fanny threw her arms around him in a spontaneous hug, the first she had initiated. "Since coming to live with him, I love it, and I love this us, our family." Stephen's arms tightened around her, and she felt a dampness against her hair that told her he was shedding a few tears of his own. "As do I, Fanny. As do I." Later that night, after Fanny had gone to bed with the locket safely around her neck, Stephen found himself drawn to the toy room. He stood in the doorway observing the changes that had occurred over the months since Fanny's arrival. The dolls that had once been static monuments to his grief were now arranged in playful vignettes that changed regularly as Fanny's imagination dictated. Books were scattered on small tables, evidence of stories read aloud to attentive porcelain audiences. A child-sized tea set bore the remnants of an actual tea party. Martha had taken to bringing real tea and cookies for Fanny and her guests. The room had transformed from a shrine to the past into a celebration of the present, and Stephen realized that somewhere along the way, his heart had undergone a similar transformation. The grief that had defined him for so long had not disappeared. He would always miss Claire and his wife, but it had softened, making space for new joy, new purpose, new love. As winter yielded to spring, and spring to another summer, Fanny continued to blossom in the nurturing environment Stephen provided. Her academic progress accelerated to the point where she was now near the top of her class in several subjects. Her circle of friends expanded, with even Violet eventually offering a grudging truce, and her confidence grew daily, nurtured by Stephen's steady belief in her abilities and worth. But perhaps the most profound change was in how she viewed herself. No longer the hungry, frightened girl who pressed her face against toy store windows, she had become someone who not only received kindness, but extended it to others. She volunteered alongside Stephen at the children's ward of the local hospital, reading stories and organizing games. She corresponded regularly with a girl at Gavinson Orphanage, sending books and small gifts from her allowance. And she had begun, speaking at Stephen's foundation events, her authentic voice adding powerful testimony to the cause of child welfare. On the anniversary of the day they had met, Stephen surprised Fanny by taking her back to the toy store where he had first seen her. The same saleswoman was there, though she didn't recognize Fanny in her fine clothes and confident posture. "May I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but reserved. "Yes," Stephen replied. "My daughter and I are looking for a very special doll." The word daughter sent a warm glow through Fanny's chest. Though Stephen had never formally adopted her, a complication related to Mrs. Kelly's legal status that his lawyers were still working to resolve, in every way that mattered, that was what she had become. "What sort of doll did you have in mind?" the saleswoman inquired. Fanny stepped forward. "One with a blue dress like the sky of a dream, one that promises comfort." She met the woman's eyes steadily, without anger or resentment for that long-ago rejection. "It's not for me, it's for a girl at Gavinson Orphanage who needs to know that sometimes wishes do come true." Understanding dawned in the saleswoman's eyes as she finally placed Fanny's face. I think I know just the one," she said, her voice softening. "Please, follow me." As they left the store with the carefully wrapped doll, Stephen placed an arm around Fanny's shoulders. "You've become quite remarkable, you know." Fanny leaned into his embrace, feeling the comforting weight of the silver locket against her chest. "I had a good example to follow." Together they walked through the bustling New York streets, no longer divided by the invisible barriers of privilege and poverty, but united by the simple, profound truth they had discovered together. That family is not defined by blood or birth, but by love and choice and the courage to begin again. In the toy room that evening, Fanny placed Hope, her first and most treasured doll, in a position of honor on the window seat. Around her she arranged all the others, some still pristine in their original clothes, others well-loved and slightly worn from months of play. "Thank you," she whispered to the blue-dressed doll that had started it all, "for leading me home." And in the gentle twilight that filled the room, it seemed to Fanny that Hope's porcelain face smiled back at her, as if to say, "You're welcome." Congratulations. Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.